The morning of my wedding, my mother slipped a card into my sister's hand. I saw it happen, right there in the bridal suite, between the hairspray and the mimosas and the sound of someone's curling iron hissing against a counter. She thought I was looking in the mirror. I was not looking in the mirror. I remember thinking, that is a thick envelope, the kind that is padded, the kind that has weight to it. I did not say anything. I was a bride. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life, and I was not about to start a fight over an envelope in a hotel bathroom in Nashville, Tennessee, with my veil half pinned to my head and blush drying on my cheeks. So I filed it away. Deep. In that place, women learn to file things when they have been doing it their entire lives. 4 hours later, I was a wife. 7 months later, I was sitting in the office of an estate attorney named Gerald Hutchins on a gray Tuesday afternoon in February, listening to him read the terms of my father's will. And that envelope, that thick padded envelope I watched my mother press into my sister Lauren's palm on the morning I got married, turned out to be a $95,000 check, a $95,000 gift. In cash. Drawn from a joint account I did not know existed. And what was in my envelope? A card. A simple white card with a printed flower border. The kind you get in a 3-pack at CV's. Inside, in my mother's handwriting, wishing you all the happiness in the world, sweetheart. We love you. That was it. That was what I got on my wedding day. And here is the thing. I would not learn the full truth of what my parents had done, and why, and for how long, until that attorney read 2 sentences from a document my father had signed 4 months before he died. 2 sentences that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Let me tell you who I was before any of this happened. Because that matters. It matters a lot. My name is Rachel Diane Calloway. Well, Rachel Diane Mercer now, after the wedding. And I grew up in a brick ranch house on Sycamore Ridge Road, just outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. My father, David Calloway, worked for a regional insurance company for 31 years. My mother, Patricia, taught 2nd grade until her knees gave out, and then she volunteered at the school library 3 days a week because she did not know how to stop being useful. We were not rich. We were not poor. We were the specific kind of comfortable that teaches you to be grateful for what you have and never ask for more. Lauren is my younger sister, by 3 years and 4 months, which felt enormous when we were kids and felt like nothing as adults. She is blonde where I am brown. She is easy where I am careful. She has always been the one who walked into a room and made people feel like the temperature went up 2 degrees. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because the truth of it explains a great deal of what comes later. Lauren was my mother's project, not in a cruel way, in the way that some mothers recognize something in one of their children, a particular kind of light, and they cannot help but cup their hands around it. My mother cupped her hands around Lauren from the time Lauren was about 7 years old and performed a 1-person dance recital in the living room that ended with a standing ovation from our parents and our dog. I was my father's project. Quieter. More methodical. I did well in school, stayed out of trouble, and followed rules the way other people follow religion. My father used to say I was the one he never worried about, and he said it like it was a compliment, and I believed him. For a long time, I believed him. I should tell you about the money, because without the money, none of this makes sense. My father was not a wealthy man by most standards, but he was a disciplined one. He had a 401k, a small brokerage account, a paid-off house, and a savings habit that had been building quietly since his 20s. My mother managed the household budget like an accountant. They clipped coupons until Lauren and I were in college. They drove the same 2 cars for 11 years. They did not take vacations that involved planes. What this meant was that by the time my father was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in August of the year I turned 32, they had accumulated, between the retirement accounts, the savings, the equity in the house, and a small inheritance my father had received from his own parents, somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. $800,000. For 2 people who drove the same 2 cars for 11 years. I knew a version of this. My father had told me, in one of those stilted practical conversations fathers have with their daughters, when they realize time is shorter than they planned, that he and my mother had been careful, and that we, Lauren and I, would be taken care of. He did not give me numbers. I did not ask for them. I was not raised to ask for them. I was raised to be grateful, to not make things difficult, to be the one nobody worried about. And I was. All the way up until the morning of my wedding, when I filed away the sight of an envelope in my mother's hand and told myself it was nothing. I met my husband, Daniel Mercer, at a conference in Atlanta when I was 29. He is a civil engineer. He has a laugh that starts somewhere in his chest and takes a second to reach his face, like it has to get permission first. I liked that about him immediately. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a Tuesday evening in October in the parking lot of a Publix, which sounds terrible but was actually perfect, because Daniel had planned this whole elaborate dinner and then gotten nervous waiting for it and proposed the moment I walked out of the grocery store with a bag of pasta and a rotisserie chicken. He says it is the most honest thing he has ever done. I believe him. Lauren was my maid of honor. This was never a question. She is my sister. She is the person I have called from every important threshold of my life. My first day of college, the night Daniel told me he loved me for the first time, the afternoon my father told us his diagnosis. Of course, she was my maid of honor. What I did not know, what I could not have known yet, was that Lauren had been having a different kind of conversation with our parents for the better part of 3 years. Private conversations. Financial conversations. The kind that happen in kitchens when one sibling is not present. I found this out later. Much later. But let me stay in the before for just a moment longer, because I want you to feel the weight of what is about to be taken from me, and what was about to be revealed. The wedding was held on a Saturday in May at a small vineyard venue outside of Franklin, Tennessee. We had saved for 2 years to pay for it. Daniel and I, ourselves. We did not ask our parents for money, partly because my father was sick and I did not want to burden them, and partly because I had been trained since childhood to handle my own things. My parents contributed $3,000 toward the catering. They wrote the check and handed it to me in person, and my mother said, "I wish it could be more, honey. I really do." My father nodded. He had lost 14 pounds by then, and his hands looked unfamiliar on the checkbook, thinner, more deliberate. I hugged them both and told them it was more than enough. I meant it. I meant every word of it. And that is the specific kind of memory that will cut you later. Not the grand betrayals, but the small ones. The hug. The words. The moment you were grateful for something that was, in context, an insult so quiet, it wore the costume of generosity. $3,000, while Lauren's card held 32 times that amount. But I did not know that yet. On my wedding day, I was just a woman in a white dress who loved her family and trusted them completely. That is where this story begins. Not with the betrayal, with the trust. Because you cannot understand how much something costs until you know how much you were willing to pay for it. Be honest with me for a second. If you had seen that envelope being passed to your sister on your wedding day, what would you have done? Because I have asked myself that question 1,000 times since then, and I still do not have a clean answer. If this kind of story hits somewhere familiar for you, you might want to stay with me for the rest of this. It gets a great deal more complicated before it gets even close to resolved. The first 7 months of my marriage were good. I want to say that clearly, because I do not want you to think I was sitting in some corner cataloging grievances from the day I said I do. I was not. I was happy. Daniel and I had rented a house in East Nashville, a narrow craftsman on Fatherland Street, with a porch that caught the afternoon light and a kitchen too small for 2 people, who both liked to cook. We made it work. We made most things work. But there was a sound underneath everything, a low frequency, the kind you feel in your back teeth before you can name it. It started small, the way these things always do. About 6 weeks after the wedding, I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon. A routine call, the kind we had been having my entire adult life. The kind where we talked about nothing and everything, for 40 minutes and hung up feeling connected. And somewhere in the middle of this particular call, I mentioned offhandedly that Daniel and I were looking at buying a house, that we had found a neighborhood we loved in Brentwood, that we were pre-approved, that we were excited, but a little nervous about the down payment. My mother said, "Oh, that is wonderful, Rachel. Good for you too." And then she changed the subject. I sat with that for a moment after I hung up. Just a moment. Then I let it go. Because what was I going to say? "Mom, I need you to offer me money?" I was not built that way. Neither was she, or so I thought. 2 weeks later, Lauren called me. Lauren, who I spoke to at least 3 times a week, who I had no reason to distrust, who was my best friend and my sister, and the person I had put in the front row of my wedding. She called to tell me that she and her boyfriend Marcus had just put an offer on a condo in the Gulch, a 2-bedroom in one of those new construction buildings that had a rooftop pool and a concierge and cost, in her words, a little more than we planned, but it is fine, everything is fine. I congratulated her. I meant it. Then I asked, the way you ask someone you are close to, casual and easy, where did you get the down payment? I did not know Marcus had that kind of savings. There was a pause on the line. Brief. The length of a thought being reorganized. Mom and Dad helped a little, she said. You know how they are. And I said, oh, of course. That is great. I know how they are. The thing about gaslighting, and I did not use that word then, I would not use it for months, is that it does not announce itself. It does not show up wearing a sign. It arrives as a series of small contradictions that your brain, because it loves the people involved, works very hard to explain away. My parents helped Lauren with a down payment. Fine. They had helped me in other ways, had they not? The $3,000 for the catering. The times my mother sent me home with groceries when I was in grad school. The used car they co-signed for me at 22. I built a mental ledger, as women do. And I balanced it in Lauren's favor because that felt safer than the alternative. But the low frequency was getting louder. My father's health declined through the fall. By October, he was on a feeding tube and sleeping most of the day. I drove to Murfreesboro every weekend. I sat with him. I watched football games he could not fully follow anymore, and I held his hand during commercials, and I did not cry in front of him, because he did not need my grief added to his own. Lauren came when she could. Her job, she said, made it difficult. She was in pharmaceutical sales, which meant she had quotas and territories, and a schedule that was, in her telling, always just slightly beyond her control. My mother never once said Lauren should come more often. She said it to me once, about myself. You do not have to come every weekend, honey. It is a long drive, but it read differently than it sounds. It read like a script that had been written for an audience of one, designed to make me feel appreciated while quietly rearranging the furniture of responsibility. I should have seen it. I know that now. But when you love someone, you choose to be blind. You choose the version of reality that keeps the people you love in the shape you need them to be. In November, my father had a good week. Clear eyes, enough energy to sit up, enough voice to have a real conversation. I drove down on a Thursday evening. I had taken the afternoon off work, and we sat on the back porch with mugs of decaf and the Tennessee sky going orange behind the tree line. And he told me he was proud of me. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. Rachel, I want you to know, I am proud of you. I always have been. And I said, I know, Dad. And he nodded, like that settled something. What he did not say, what I would only understand months later, sitting in Gerald Hutchins' office on a gray Tuesday in February, was that he had already done something I would never have expected from him. Something calculated. Something that would force a reckoning none of us were ready for. He had changed his will. But I did not know that yet. On that Thursday evening in November, he was just my father, proud of me on a back porch, and I was just his daughter, grateful to be there. My father died on December 11th, at 4:47 in the morning. My mother called me, and I remember the exact smell of our bedroom in that moment. Something like sleep and dry heat from the radiator, and the faint ghost of Daniel's shampoo. The ordinary, specific smell of a life that was about to shift. I drove to Murfreesboro in the dark. Lauren was already there. She had driven up the night before, which surprised me. She knew something I did not. I did not realize that then. I do now. If you have ever watched a parent go and felt like something else was leaving the room with them, something you could not name yet, then you know exactly where I was. Standing in that moment. Stories like this one happen more often than we want to believe. That is why I keep sharing them. If this is landing somewhere real for you, you might want to stay with me for part 3. Because what happens next, I genuinely did not see it coming. The will reading was scheduled for 7 weeks after my father's death. Gerald Hutchins had been my parents' attorney for 20 years, a small, careful man with a cluttered desk in a building off Church Street in downtown Nashville that smelled like old paper and central heating. He had a habit of removing his glasses to clean them at pivotal moments, which I now suspect was a professional strategy to give the room time to absorb information before he continued. My mother sat to my left. Lauren sat beside her. Daniel had offered to come. I told him I would be fine. I was not fine, but I did not know that yet. The will was largely what I expected. The house to my mother. The retirement accounts structured as a survivor's benefit. A few specific items. My grandfather's watch to no one in particular, which surprised me, and a set of first edition books to a cousin I had not seen in 12 years. Which did not. And then Gerald Hutchins removed his glasses. He cleaned them slowly with a small cloth he kept in his breast pocket. Put them back on. Looked at the document. In addition to the above, he read, I am directing the following allocation from the joint savings account held at First Tennessee Bank, account ending in 7741, to be distributed as follows. I felt my mother shift in the chair beside me, a small movement, the kind a body makes when it has been waiting for a specific sentence. To my daughter Lauren Christine Calloway, the sum of $95,000, reflecting a portion of the financial assistance previously extended to her during my lifetime, and intended to equalize this gift in the record of my estate. Equalize. That word. Equalize. To my daughter Rachel Diane Calloway Mercer, the sum of $180,000, reflecting the balance of the joint savings account after Lauren's allocation, and in recognition of Rachel's financial independence, and the sacrifices she made in caring for this family without expectation of compensation. The room was very quiet. The central heating hummed. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. Gerald Hutchins set the document down with the particular care of a man who has delivered difficult news before and understands that silence is part of his job. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the window. Lauren was looking at her hands, and I understood, in the cold, sudden, total way you understand something, when every small confusion of the past year lines up in a single instant, that the $95,000 check my mother had pressed into Lauren's hand on my wedding day was not a gift. It was a withdrawal, an advance, a transaction that my father had not sanctioned. My mother had given Lauren $95,000 from their joint savings account, the account that would become part of my father's estate, before his death, before the will could distribute it. And my father, who apparently knew, or discovered, had written the correction into the document himself, had sat with Gerald Hutchins, and quietly, precisely, rebalanced what his wife had already tried to tip. He had left me a paper trail. My father, the insurance man who drove the same car for 11 years and balanced everything on a ledger, had left me a paper trail. I did not cry in Gerald Hutchins' office. I want to be clear about that, because crying would have been appropriate, and appropriate was no longer the operating principle. I drove home. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table on Fatherland Street, and I called Daniel, and I told him everything in the flat sequential voice I use when I am functioning from the part of myself that is past the emotion and into the logistics. He listened. He said very little. When I was finished, he said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to understand what actually happened." So that is what I did. I want to tell you something about evidence gathering that they do not show you in movies. It is not exciting. It is not a montage. It is sitting at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cold cup of coffee, writing down dates. It is calling your father's bank, politely, calmly, and requesting transaction histories. It is reading through 3 years of statements and circling transfers with a blue pen until your hand cramps. It is boring. It is painstaking. It is the most important work I have ever done. Here is what I found. The $95,000 check given to Lauren on my wedding day in May was not the first transfer. It was the largest and the most recent, but it was not the first. Between January of the previous year and the date of my wedding, my mother had transferred money from the joint savings account to Lauren on 6 separate occasions. The amounts ranged from $8,000 to $22,000. The total, across all 6 transfers plus the wedding check, came to $147,500. $147,500. Moved, quietly, to one daughter, without the knowledge, or, it turned out, without the full knowledge, of the other. My father had known about some of it. Gerald Hutchins. In a follow-up call I requested 3 days after the will reading, confirmed that my father had confronted my mother about the transfers approximately 8 months before he died, that the two of them had, and Gerald Hutchins chose his words the way a man chooses steps across ice, reached an understanding about what the will would need to correct. My father had not told me. He had not warned me. He had simply written a document that told the truth after he was gone, because he was a man who believed in ledgers and balances, and the quiet authority of correct paperwork. And in doing so, he handed me something my mother had never intended me to have. The full picture. I sat with that for 3 days. I did not call Lauren. I did not call my mother. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I slept beside my husband. And underneath all of it, I was running a very quiet, very focused calculation about what I was going to do next. Because here is what I had. A will that documented preferential financial treatment. Bank records that confirmed unauthorized transfers, a legal inheritance that my father had deliberately structured to correct an imbalance my mother had created. And here is what I did not yet have. A conversation. The kind that cannot be walked back. The kind that ends things, or changes them forever. I was not ready to have it yet. But I was getting close. I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been making decisions about your life without telling you? That there were conversations happening in rooms you were never invited into? Because that is a specific kind of pain. It does not feel like anger at first. It feels like the floor shifting. If you know someone who needs to hear that they are not imagining it, that this kind of thing is real and it happens, you might want to share this with them. It was Lauren who forced my hand. Not my mother. Not the bank records. Not the will. Lauren. 3 weeks after the will reading. 3 weeks during which I had said nothing. Called regularly. Showed up to Sunday dinners in Murfreesboro, and passed the green beans and asked my mother how she was sleeping. Lauren called me on a Wednesday evening and said she needed to talk. I said of course. She said she was worried about how things had been left, that the will had created some confusion, that she thought it was important for the family to be on the same page. I said I agreed completely. She said, and I am going to give you her exact words because they have lived in my body ever since. She said, Rachel, I think you should consider disclaiming your inheritance. Disclaiming. She used that word, the legal word. The word you use when you want someone to formally refuse what they are owed so that it passes to someone else. She had done research. My little sister, who had schedule conflicts every weekend our father was dying, had consulted a legal dictionary sometime between the will reading and this Wednesday phone call, and arrived at the word disclaimer with the confidence of someone who has already decided how the conversation ends. She said our mother was stressed. She said the money had been given to her in good faith, and that she had already spent a significant portion of it. The condo, some credit card debt, a few other things she listed with a vagueness that told me the list was longer than she was willing to say. She said it would cause enormous hardship to have to pay it back. She said she hoped I understood. She said she hoped I understood. I held the phone against my ear and looked out the kitchen window at the narrow backyard on Fatherland Street, where the last of the winter light was sitting flat and gray on the Fence posts. The refrigerator hummed. There was a cup of tea on the counter that I had made and forgotten to drink. And something in me went very, very quiet. Not angry, not hurt, not the kind of raw and ragged feeling I had been carrying for 3 weeks. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a decision. I told Lauren I would think about it. I used a warm voice, a reasonable voice. The voice of a woman who has spent her entire life being the one nobody worried about, deployed now with surgical precision. I hung up. I picked up the cup of tea. I poured it down the drain. Then I called Gerald Hutchins. Gerald Hutchins had been expecting to hear from me. I know this because when I said my name to his receptionist, I was put through in under 40 seconds. No hold music. No let me check if he is available. 40 seconds. I told him about Lauren's call, the disclaimer request, the word she had used, and the confidence with which she had used it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Mercer, I want to be very clear with you about something." He said the $95,000 transfer made by my mother in May, the wedding day check, had been drawn from a joint account whose assets were legally subject to estate distribution upon my father's death. He said that my father, in changing his will, had formally documented this transfer as an advance against Lauren's share, which meant the will was structured to account for it, to correct it. He said disclaiming my inheritance would not erase that accounting. It would simply redirect the money. And he said, very carefully, very precisely, in the voice of a man who has spent 20 years watching families make irreversible decisions, that I had every legal right to pursue the full distribution as written, including seeking recovery of funds transferred prior to my father's death, if I believed those transfers had been made in conflict with my father's wishes. Recovery. That was the word he used. I asked him what that would look like in practice. He told me. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Here is what I want you to understand about the decision I made next. It was not made in anger. It was not made from greed. It was made from a very clear-eyed reading of what had happened and what it meant, not just financially, but as a statement about who I was to my family, what I was worth to them, what they had decided, quietly and collectively, without ever asking me. They had decided I could handle it, that I was strong enough to get less, that my stability was a resource they could spend. I decided they were right, that I could handle it. They were wrong about everything else. I did not disclaim. I accepted the full inheritance as written, $180,000, the corrected balance, the amount my father had calculated and documented, and left me with the specific intention that I would receive it. I then retained a separate estate attorney, a woman named Carol Okafor in Brentwood, who had been recommended to me by a colleague, and who wore very good shoes and spoke in the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who wins quietly, to send a formal letter to my mother. The letter documented the 6 prior transfers. The full $147,500. It noted that these transfers, made from a joint account during my father's lifetime but without documented mutual consent, were potentially subject to review as estate assets. It did not make threats. It did not use dramatic language. It was 4 paragraphs of clean, specific, correct information. It also included a proposal, not for full recovery, not for litigation. A proposal for a structured acknowledgement, a formal signed document in which my mother confirmed the existence and amounts of the transfers, and in which Lauren agreed to a repayment schedule for a portion of the funds, to be paid to me directly over 3 years, not the full $147,500, $60,000, over 3 years, $20,000 a year, reasonable, documented, enforceable. Carol Okafor mailed the letter on a Thursday morning. By Saturday afternoon, my mother had called me 4 times. I did not answer. By Sunday evening, Lauren had sent 11 text messages ranging from disbelief to anger to a final one that said simply, "I cannot believe you are doing this to our family." I read that last one twice. To our family. I thought about the envelope, the CV's card with a flower border, the hug in the bridal suite, and my mother saying I wish it could be more. The green beans at Sunday dinner while I sat on 3 weeks of silence, Lauren on the phone with the word disclaimer ready in her mouth, like something she had been rehearsing. I texted back 4 words. Talk to Carol Okafor. Then I put my phone face down on the counter, and I went to sit on the porch with Daniel, and we watched the streetlights come on one by one on Fatherland Street. And he held my hand, and neither of us said anything for a long time. That silence felt different from all the other silences. It felt chosen. My mother signed the acknowledgement document 6 weeks later. Lauren signed it 4 days after that, after her own attorney, paid for. I later learned, partially by my mother, advised her that Carol Okafor's letter was not a bluff and that her exposure under a formal estate dispute would be considerably worse than $20,000 a year. The first payment arrived by check in March. It cleared. I want to tell you this felt like a victory. And in some narrow technical sense it was. The ledger was being corrected. The paperwork was in order. My father's careful, quiet intervention from beyond a document signed in an attorney's office had done exactly what he intended it to do. But here's the thing about winning something like this. Nobody throws a parade. My relationship with my mother is not what it was. It is not broken exactly. We still talk. We still have Sunday calls. She still asks about Daniel and the house we eventually bought in Brentwood, a 3-bedroom with a yard. That gets afternoon light, the way I always wanted. But there is a layer of glass between us now that was not there before. I can see her through it. I can hear her through it. I cannot get to the version of her that existed before I understood what she was capable of choosing. Lauren and I are cordial. That is the honest word. Cordial. We exchange birthday texts. We attended a cousin's graduation together in April and were perfectly pleasant for 4 hours, and then drove home in separate cars. She is paying the $20,000 a year. She has not missed a payment. She has also, not once, in any of our conversations since the letter was signed, said the word sorry. I have stopped waiting for it. What I keep returning to, what I cannot seem to fully put down, is my father. David Calloway. The insurance man. The ledger keeper. The man who drove the same car for 11 years and said I was the one he never worried about like it was a compliment. He knew. He knew what my mother had done, and he did not tell me. He did not warn me. He sat with me on that back porch in November with a mug of decaf and the orange Tennessee sky, and he told me he was proud of me, and he did not say a single word about what was waiting in his will. I have spent a long time trying to decide how to feel about that. Some days I think he was protecting me, giving me the porch, giving me the moment, giving me the clean version of him before the paperwork told me the complicated version. Some days I think he was a coward. Some days I think he was both, which is the most honest answer and the hardest one to hold. He loved me. I believe that completely. He also made a choice, over and over, to keep the peace with my mother at the cost of transparency with me. And then, at the end, when he could not make that choice anymore, when his body was running out of time, and the ledger had to be settled, he handed the whole thing to a lawyer and a document and left me to find out in a room that smelled like old paper and central heating. That is not the neat, forgivable kind of love. That is the complicated, real kind. The kind that holds tenderness and failure in the same hand and offers them both to you at once. I accepted my inheritance. I bought the house in Brentwood. I planted a garden in the backyard that is currently, as of this spring, producing more tomatoes than Daniel and I can possibly eat. I go to work. I come home. I hold my husband's hand on the porch and watch the streetlights come on, and sometimes, in the particular quiet of a Sunday afternoon, I think about a thick padded envelope being pressed into my sister's palm, about the specific weight of it, about the fact that I saw it happen and filed it away and chose, for 1 more hour, to be the one nobody worried about. I do not do that anymore. I am done filing things away. I want to leave you with a question, and I want you to take it seriously. How many things have you filed away? How many moments did you see clearly and choose not to name? Because naming them would have cost you something. A relationship, a version of your family, a story about yourself. You needed to keep believing? I am not judging. I did it for years. But I would really like to know, would you have done what I did? Would you have sent that letter? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel a little less alone in something you have been carrying, subscribe, because there are more stories like this. There always are. My name is Rachel, and I am the one nobody worried about, until I was.